Sleep well, Grandpa.
The little girl whispered it like a secret, her voice barely louder than the fire crackling at the other end of the room. She had just pushed a thick envelope stuffed with $5,000 in cash away from the edge of the table so it wouldn't fall. She hadn't counted it. She hadn't even opened it. She simply didn't want it to fall. Then she untied the faded pink ribbon from her own hair, the only pretty thing she owned, and carefully tied together the front of the old man's open cardigan so the cold air wouldn't reach his chest. She never knew he wasn't asleep. He was one of the wealthiest men in Boston, and he was pretending to sleep to catch a thief. Every adult who had entered that library before her had reached for the envelope. She reached for his collar instead. Before sunrise, that same man would be sitting alone in his library, holding that tiny ribbon in his trembling hands, crying harder than he had in more than 20 years. But what did one poor little girl see that everyone else had missed? If this story already has you feeling something, stay with it. What comes next is the part that changes everything. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. There are more stories like this one, and you won't want to miss them. Arthur Pembroke had not always been a man who tested people. There was a time long before the mansion, before the boardrooms, before his name appeared on the side of buildings, when he had trusted easily and loved without conditions. That version of Arthur had been built slowly, carefully, by a woman named Eleanor, who had married him when he had nothing and loved him when he had everything. Eleanor died more than 20 years ago, and she took most of him with her. What remained was a man of 76 who lived alone in a house far too large for one person who ate his meals in silence and who had learned through grief and betrayal both that people rarely showed you who they truly were unless something valuable was sitting within reach. His 3 children had not attended their mother's funeral together. They had arrived separately, each with their own lawyer, each asking quiet questions about the will before Eleanor was in the ground. Edward, the eldest, called every Sunday, but only after the stock market closed. Margaret sent birthday cards that her assistant signed. Thomas visited twice a year and spent most of each visit walking through rooms with the careful eyes of a man taking inventory. Arthur watched all of it. He said nothing. Instead, he developed a habit. On mornings when the loneliness felt especially heavy, he would settle into the tall leather chair in his library place, a sealed envelope containing $5,000 on the table beside him, close his eyes, and wait. Housekeepers, contractors, his own children. One by one, they all reached for it. Not one of them had ever simply let it sit. He had stopped expecting anyone to. He had simply stopped expecting anything from anyone at all. The new housekeeper arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November. Her name was Clara Hayes. She was 34 years old, slight-framed, with the kind of tired that doesn't show on the face so much as in the way a person moves, careful, efficient, never wasting a single motion. She had been hired through the staffing agency 3 days prior and had not been late, had not asked unnecessary questions, and had brought her own cleaning supplies because she wasn't sure what would be provided. She had also brought her daughter. The school had sent a notice the night before, a heating system failure classes canceled until further notice. Clara had no one to call. She had packed Lily's backpack with a book, a small lunch, and strict instructions, and she had brought her along with the quiet resignation of a woman who had long since stopped apologizing for circumstances beyond her control. Lily was 7 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and a faded pink ribbon tied in her hair that she wore every single day without exception. Clara brought her daughter to the library first, the quietest room in the house, far from the hallways she needed to clean. She knelt down to Lily's level at the door. "You sit in that chair and you do not move," she said low and firm. "You do not touch anything, you do not make noise, and you do not bother the gentleman sleeping in the corner. Do you understand me?" Lily nodded. Clara smoothed her daughter's ribbon, once stood up and left. For the first few minutes, Lily did exactly as she was told. She sat in the chair closest to the door, hands folded in her lap, feet dangling above the floor. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the rows of books lining every wall from floor to ceiling. She looked at the tall windows where the gray November light pressed itself flat against the glass. Then she looked at the table beside the old man. The envelope was moving. Not dramatically, just slowly, incrementally, the way things shift when a house settles and a surface isn't perfectly level. But Lily could see it clearly. The thick envelope was sliding toward the edge of the table, one quiet millimeter at a time. She waited to see if it would stop on its own. It didn't. She climbed down from her chair, crossed the room in her sneakers without making a sound, and pressed the envelope gently back toward the center of the table with 2 fingers. Then she noticed a small leather notebook lying on the floor beside the table's leg. She picked it up, looked at it for a moment, and set it carefully on the table beside the envelope. She turned to go back to her chair. That was when she saw his hands. The old man was sitting with his head resting against the high back of the chair, his cardigan hanging open at the front, both sides fallen away from each other. His hands rested on his knees, thin, pale, the knuckles large and the skin loose, and even from where Lily stood, she could see they were cold. The kind of cold that settles into old bones and doesn't leave easily. She looked at the cardigan. She looked at the buttons. She stepped closer and tried to fasten them, but the buttons were stiff and her fingers were small, and no matter how carefully she tried, she couldn't make them catch. She stepped back and looked around the room. There was nothing nearby, no blanket, no scarf. She reached up and touched the ribbon in her hair. It took her a moment, not because she was reluctant, but because she wanted to do it right. She pulled the ribbon free, slowly smoothed it between her palms, and then leaned forward and looped it through the 2 front panels of the cardigan, tying them together in a small, careful bow at the center. She stepped back to check her work. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. She looked at his face, the deep lines, the silver stubble, the stillness of a man who had been alone for a very long time, and something in her chest felt the way it did when she saw a bird sitting by itself on a wire. She leaned in slightly and whispered, "Sleep well, Grandpa?" On the other side of his eyelids, Arthur Pembroke had gone completely still. He had seen every detail through the thin gap beneath his lashes, the envelope, the notebook, the buttons, the ribbon. He had watched all of it. And the moment the ribbon touched his cardigan, something moved in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. A sudden sharp recognition, not of the girl, but of the gesture. Eleanor had done this exact thing once in a different life, in a cold apartment with no heating, laughing softly as she tied her own ribbon around the front of his jacket, because the zipper had broken, and they couldn't afford to replace it. "I'll keep you warm one way or another," she had said. Arthur did not open his eyes. But behind them, for the first time in over 20 years, something that had been closed for a long time began very quietly to open. They arrived 20 minutes later, as they often did, unannounced, unhurried, moving through the front door of the mansion with the ease of people who had already begun to think of it as theirs. Edward came first, still in his overcoat, phone in hand. Margaret followed her heels, clicking against the marble foyer floor with a precision that always made the household staff straighten instinctively. Thomas came last, hands in his pockets, eyes moving across every room he passed through with the quiet attention of a man who catalogued things without meaning to. They found their father in the library, or rather they found a child standing next to their father in the library. Edward stopped in the doorway. Margaret nearly walked into him. Thomas looked over both their shoulders and said nothing, but his expression shifted in a way that was not quite concern and not quite anything generous. The girl, small, dark-eyed, wearing a worn backpack and sneakers with Velcro straps, stood beside Arthur's chair without touching him, looking up at the 3 newcomers with the calm, unreadable expression of a child who had learned early not to react to adults before understanding what they wanted. "Who is this?" Edward said. "Not to the girl, to the room." Margaret's gaze moved from the child to the table to the envelope sitting at its center, and something in her face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Where is the housekeeper?" she said. Arthur opened his eyes. He took his time. He looked at the ribbon tied at the front of his cardigan. He looked at his 3 children standing in the doorway, their stiffness, the particular quality of their alarm, the way not one of them had looked at Lily with anything resembling warmth. They were not worried about him. He understood that clearly. They were worried about proximity, about access, about a stranger standing too close to something they considered theirs. She's working, Arthur said, his voice flat and even. Which is what she was hired to do. Father, there's a child in your library, Margaret said. I can see that. Unsupervised. She's been perfectly supervised, Arthur said, and looked at Lily once briefly, carefully, before returning his gaze to his children. It's the adults in this room I'm less certain about. A silence fell over the library that none of them quite knew how to fill. Arthur let it sit. Then he raised one hand slightly and said, "Give us the room." Edward looked like he wanted to say something more. He didn't. Margaret's jaw tightened. Thomas had already turned toward the hallway. One by one they left. The door did not quite close behind them. Arthur did not call anyone back to close it. He simply returned to the position he had been in before, eyes half-closed, hands resting on his knees, and the library went quiet again. He was not finished. Arthur let another minute pass in silence. Then he shifted in his chair, made a show of stirring slowly as though waking, and looked down at the ribbon tied across the front of his cardigan. He brought a hand up and touched it, then lifted his eyes to Lily with an expression that was carefully constructed to be something between displeasure and accusation. "What is this?" he said. Lily stood very still. "I tied your cardigan, so you wouldn't be cold." "This is a $200 cardigan," Arthur said, "and you've put a hair ribbon on it." He turned it over with 2 fingers as though examining damage. "Do you have any idea what this fabric is?" Lily looked at the ribbon, then back at him. She didn't answer. "Where is your mother?" The question landed before Lily could respond. Clara appeared in the doorway. 30 seconds later, she had heard the shift in tone from the hallway and had come at a near run, arriving with a cloth still in one hand and the expression of someone bracing for the worst. She took in the scene in a single glance, her daughter standing alone, the old man sitting upright, the ribbon on his cardigan. "Mr. Pembroke," she said carefully, "I'm so sorry. Whatever happened, I take full responsibility." "Your daughter put her ribbon on my clothing," Arthur said. Clara looked at Lily. Lily looked back at her mother with eyes that were steady and a little too wide, the particular look of a child trying very hard not to cry in front of a stranger. "Lily," Clara's voice was low and controlled, "did you touch Mr. Pembroke's things?" "His cardigan was open," Lily said quietly. "His hands looked cold." Clara closed her eyes for half a second. When she opened them, she looked directly at Arthur. "I'll cover any damage," she said. "Whatever you need, I'll work extra hours. I'll come in on weekends. I'm not asking you to overlook it. I'm just asking you not to—" She stopped, started again. "Please don't let this affect my position here." She did not say, "I need this job," but it was present in every word she said. Arthur watched her. He watched the way she had not once blamed her daughter, the way Lily had not once tried to make excuses for herself, the way they both simply stood there quiet, steady, braced the way people stand when they have been through worse and survived it. He said nothing. He was still watching when Lily slowly unzipped her backpack. The music box was small enough to fit in both of Lily's hands. It was made of wood, dark, worn smooth in the places that had been touched most often, with a simple painted flower on the lid that had faded to almost nothing over the years. One of the hinges was slightly bent. The clasp no longer clicked the way it once had. It was not by any measure a valuable object. Lily set it on the table in front of Arthur with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something irreplaceable. "You can keep it," she said. Her voice was steady, but her chin was doing something she was trying hard to control. "It plays music. It's pretty." She paused. "Please don't fire my mommy." Arthur did not move. He looked at the music box. He looked at the ribbon still tied across the front of his cardigan. He looked at the child standing on the other side of the table, 7 years old, backpack still half open, offering him the only thing she owned that mattered, with no guarantee it would work, and no plan beyond the offering itself. There was no calculation in it. He had spent decades learning to recognize calculation in boardrooms, in courtrooms, across dinner tables, in his own children's faces. He knew exactly what it looked like, and exactly what it didn't. This was a child who had nothing and was handing him the last of it. Not to impress him, not to gain something, only to protect her mother. Clara made a small sound beside her daughter, not quite a word, just a breath, and reached out to put her hand on Lily's shoulder. "Lily, sweetheart, you don't have to—" "Grandma gave it to me," Lily said, still looking at Arthur. "Before she went to heaven. It's the most special thing I have." She swallowed. "But Mommy is more special." The library was very quiet. Outside the tall windows, a thin snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, drifting down without urgency against the gray morning sky. Arthur sat with his hands resting on his knees and looked at the music box for a long time. Then he looked up at the girl. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he had absolutely nothing to say. Arthur reached out and pushed the music box gently back across the table toward Lily. "Keep it," he said. Lily looked at it, then at him. She didn't pick it up yet. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened in his chair slowly and looked at Clara with the expression of a man who had decided something. "I wasn't asleep," he said. Clara blinked. "This morning, when your daughter came in." He gestured toward the envelope on the table. "That money has been sitting there since before you arrived. I put it there myself. I do it regularly." He paused. "I wanted to see what people would do when they thought no one was watching." The room was still. Clara looked at the envelope, then at her daughter, then back at Arthur. When she spoke, her voice was not loud and it was not angry. It was simply tired, the particular exhaustion of someone saying something they had needed to say for a very long time to no one in particular and had finally found an accidental audience. "Poor people are tested every single day just to survive," she said. "Every job application, every landlord, every grocery line where you're counting before you get to the register." She stopped, then continued evenly. "I never thought we'd be tested here, too." Arthur said nothing. There was no defense he could offer that would have been worth offering. He had built the test carefully and deliberately, had been proud of its precision even, and now it sat between them in the room like something he no longer wanted to claim. He had designed it to expose the worst in people. He had not considered what it might reveal about himself. Clara did not press further. She was not performing outrage. She had said what was true, and she was finished saying it. She put her hand on Lily's shoulder, picked up the music box from the table, and placed it gently back in her daughter's hands and closed the backpack. "Come on, baby," she said quietly. Lily put the strap over one shoulder. Then she looked at Arthur one last time. Lily looked at him the way children look at things they don't fully understand, but feel very clearly. Not with pity, not with judgment. Just with the open, unhurried attention of someone who had not yet learned to look away from difficult things. She said very quietly, "I hope you feel warmer now, Grandpa." Then she turned and followed her mother out of the library. The door swung shut behind them with a soft, final click. Arthur did not move for a long time. The fire at the far end of the room had burned down to embers. The snow outside the windows was falling steadily now, covering the garden in a thin white silence. The envelope sat at the center of the table where Lily had pushed it, untouched, undisturbed, exactly where a 7-year-old had decided it belonged. He reached up slowly and untied the ribbon from the front of his cardigan. He held it in his palm and looked at it. It was nothing materially, a strip of pink fabric faded from washing, slightly frayed at one end where it had been retied too many times. The kind of thing that cost less than $1 and lasted years because someone had taken care of it. Eleanor had owned one almost exactly like it. He had not thought about that ribbon, Eleanor's ribbon, in years. He had not allowed himself to. But it came back to him now with a completeness that surprised him. A cold apartment on the 4th floor of a building with unreliable heat, the two of them young and tired and laughing anyway, Eleanor pulling the ribbon from her hair and looping it through the front of his jacket because the zipper had given out, and they had no money to replace it. "There," she had said, smoothing it flat against his chest. "Now you're kept." He had laughed. She had laughed. They had been so young. He had promised her near the end that he would not become someone she wouldn't recognize. She had held his hand and told him she wasn't worried. She had always believed the best of him, even when the evidence was thin. He had broken that promise so gradually that he hadn't noticed it happening. The test. The envelope. The careful architecture of his own suspicion, he had told himself it was wisdom experience, the reasonable conclusion of a man who had been deceived too many times. He had told himself Eleanor would have understood. She wouldn't have. She would have looked at him the same way Lily had not with anger, but with that quiet, undefended sadness that is somehow harder to bear than anger, and she would have said, "Arthur, what happened to you?" He sat in the library until the last of the firelight died. Then he sat in the dark. He held the ribbon in both hands, and he cried not politely, not briefly, but the way a person cries when they have been holding something back for 20 years, and the thing that finally breaks it open is a child's hair ribbon and 4 words spoken by someone who owed him nothing. He cried for Eleanor. He cried for the man he had promised her he would be. He cried because a 7-year-old girl with nothing in her backpack had walked into his library and done what none of his children had managed in over a decade. She had made him feel like someone worth keeping warm. He found her in the front hallway at 7:45 in the morning. Clara had arrived early. She always arrived early, Arthur would later learn, and was pulling on her coat to leave when he came down the stairs. She stopped when she saw him. She had the careful stillness of someone who had spent the night preparing for this moment and still wasn't certain which version of it she was about to face. Arthur stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom. He was holding the pink ribbon. "I owe you an apology," he said. Clara said nothing. She waited. "What I did yesterday was not a test of your character," he said. "It was a demonstration of mine." He paused. "I've been conducting that exercise for years, and I convinced myself it was a reasonable thing to do. Your daughter made it very clear that it wasn't." He came down the last 3 steps and stood in the hallway. "I'd like to offer you a permanent position," he said. "A formal contract. Full benefits, a salary that reflects the actual value of the work." He named a number. Clara's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, the almost imperceptible loosening of someone who has been braced for a long time. "I'd also like to cover your daughter's education," he said. "All of it, whatever school she chooses from now through university. No conditions." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. It was a fair question, and he had expected it. "Because your daughter walked into my library, and the first thing she did was make sure nothing fell off my table," he said. "And the last thing she did was hope I was warm." He looked down at the ribbon in his hand. "No one has done anything like that for me in a very long time. I'm not sure I deserved it then either. But I'd like to try to be someone who does." Clara was quiet. "I don't want charity," she said at last. "I've never wanted charity." "I know," Arthur said. "This isn't charity. It's a debt I owe to someone who reminded me who I used to be." Another silence. Outside the front windows, the snow from the night before lay clean and undisturbed across the garden. Clara looked at the ribbon in his hand, then at his face. "Lily will be here on Saturday," she said. "She doesn't have school." "Good," Arthur said. He meant it. Lily came on Saturday. She sat in the same chair she had sat in before in the same library with her backpack on her lap and her ribbon back in her hair. Clara had found her an identical one at the drugstore, which Lily had accepted with great seriousness and tied herself. She looked around at the books with the expression of someone trying to memorize a room. Arthur sat across from her with a cup of coffee and a newspaper he wasn't reading. They didn't talk much that first morning. They didn't need to. By the time Clara came to collect her at noon, Lily had worked her way through half a picture book from the lowest shelf, and Arthur had drunk 3 cups of coffee and read the same paragraph 6 times without retaining a word of it. It was by a significant margin the best morning he'd had in years. 3 years later, Lily was 10. She came to the library every Saturday without exception, and on school holidays and on the occasional weekday afternoon, when Clara's shift ended late, and Arthur had quietly suggested it was easier for everyone if Lily simply waited inside rather than on the front steps. One Saturday in February, Arthur fell asleep in his chair. He hadn't meant to. He had been reading, and the fire was warm, and the room was quiet in the particular way it was only quiet when Lily was in it. A lived-in silence comfortable and undemanding. He woke to find a blanket across his lap that had not been there before, and Lily sitting cross-legged on the rug with a book open in front of her, not looking at him, giving him the privacy of pretending she hadn't noticed. He said nothing, she said nothing. He picked up his book and they continued the afternoon. When Lily was 16, she found the ribbon. She had been looking for a pen in the top drawer of Arthur's desk. He had told her to help herself. And there it was, folded neatly, sitting by itself in the corner of the drawer, as though it had been placed rather than stored. "Is this mine?" she asked, holding it up. Arthur looked up from his reading. "It was," he said, "for a while." She looked at it. "Why do you keep it in your desk?" He was quiet for a moment, then he set his book down. He told her about Eleanor. Not all of it there were parts that still belonged only to him, but enough. The cold apartment, the broken zipper, the ribbon tied across his chest on a winter morning decades ago, by a woman who thought keeping him warm was the most natural thing in the world. Lily listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set the ribbon carefully back in the drawer exactly where she had found it. "She sounds like she was really good at loving people," Lily said. Arthur looked at her. "She was," he said. "So are you." Lily didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Edward noticed the change in his father first. Not because he was the most perceptive of the three, he wasn't, but because he was the most vigilant about things that affected his interests. And a child appearing regularly in Arthur Pembroke's library, being driven to school in Arthur Pembroke's car, having her tuition paid by Arthur Pembroke's accounts, these were things that showed up in the margins of spreadsheets and triggered questions from lawyers. He raised it over dinner one Sunday, carefully in the tone he used when he wanted to appear casual. "This girl," he said, "the housekeeper's daughter, how long has this arrangement been going on?" "Her name is Lily," Arthur said. "Of course. Lily." Edward set down his fork. "Father, I think it's worth having a conversation about—" "We're having one now," Arthur said. "You were saying—" Edward looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Thomas. "We're just concerned," Margaret said, picking up the thread smoothly. "You're generous, Father, you always have been. But people can take advantage of that generosity, especially people who—" "Who what?" Arthur said. The table was quiet. "Who have very little," Margaret finished after a pause that had lasted too long to be recovered from. Arthur looked at each of his children in turn. He did it slowly, without expression, the way he had once looked at people across negotiating tables when he wanted them to understand that he saw exactly what they were doing. Lily Hayes. He said, "Walked into my library when she was 7 years old and pushed my things away from the edge of the table so they wouldn't fall. She tried to button my cardigan because my hands looked cold. When she couldn't manage the buttons, she gave me the ribbon out of her own hair." He paused. "Then she offered me the only valuable thing she owned to keep her mother from being fired." He picked up his fork. "Tell me," he said, "which one of you has ever done anything like that?" No one answered. Dinner continued in near silence. In the years that followed, Edward called less. Margaret's assistant stopped sending birthday cards. Thomas's twice-yearly visits dwindled to once, then stopped altogether. Arthur noted their absence the same way he noted most things, now clearly without illusion, and without the particular pain it might once have caused him. He had Lily on Saturdays. He had Clara's quiet competence filling the house with the feeling of a place being cared for. He had the ribbon in his desk drawer. It was more than enough. He was 89 when he died on a Thursday morning in early spring, in his library chair, with a book open in his lap, and the thin sun coming through the tall windows and lying across the floor in long yellow bars. Per his instructions left in writing with his attorney years prior, the ribbon had been removed from his desk drawer and placed inside the sealed envelope that would be read at the will. The reading of the will took place on a Friday morning in April. Edward, Margaret, and Thomas arrived together for the first time in years, circumstance having accomplished what affection no longer could. They sat on one side of the long conference table in Arthur's attorney's office, and Lily sat on the other side with Clara beside her, and the attorney read the document in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who had done this many times and understood that the silences between sentences often mattered more than the sentences themselves. The estate was substantial. Everyone in the room knew the number more or less. What Edward, Margaret, and Thomas did not know, what none of them had anticipated despite all their vigilance and all their careful Sunday dinners and all their quiet conversations with lawyers, was the distribution. The attorney read it clearly. The majority of Arthur Pembroke's estate was to be left to Lily Hayes. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Edward said something sharp, and Margaret's composure slipped, and Thomas pushed back his chair, and the attorney waited with the patience of someone who had learned not to take these moments personally. Lily sat still through all of it. When the room had settled back into an uneasy silence, the attorney slid a sealed envelope across the table toward her. It was labeled in Arthur's handwriting, the same careful, slightly cramped script she had seen in the margins of his books for years. She opened it. The letter was not long. Arthur had never been a man who used more words than necessary. It read, "Everyone wanted my money. She was the only one who gave me something before she knew who I was. She gave me a ribbon. I gave her everything I had left. I consider it the most reasonable transaction of my life. Take care of the people who need it. You already know how. A." At the bottom of the envelope, wrapped in a small square of tissue paper, was the pink ribbon. Lily held it in her hands for a long time. Clara put an arm around her shoulders and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said better. She was 29 when she established the Eleanor Pembroke Foundation, named for a woman she had never met, but felt in some way she couldn't fully articulate that she had always known. The foundation supported single mothers and their children, housing assistance, educational grants, emergency funds, job placement. It was practical and unglamorous and exactly what it needed to be. In the entrance hall of the foundation's main building, mounted on the wall in a small glass case, was the pink ribbon. Beneath it, a single line. "Kindness is never measured by its price, but by the love behind it." People stopped in front of it often, some briefly, some for longer than they expected. It didn't look like much, a faded strip of pink fabric behind glass, but there was something about it that made people slow down. Maybe it was the simplicity of it. Maybe it was the knowledge of what it had done. A child had walked into a room with nothing and left something behind that changed a man entirely. Not because she had planned to, not because she had known who he was or what he had, but because his hands had looked cold and she had something to give, and it had not occurred to her to do anything other than give it. If this story stayed with you, it's meant to. There's something about Lily that most of us recognize, even if we can't name it right away. She didn't do anything extraordinary. She just noticed. She noticed an envelope sliding off a table. She noticed an old man's hands were cold. She noticed that the person in front of her needed something she could give. That's it. That's the whole thing. And somehow that was enough to reach someone who had spent 20 years deciding the world had nothing left to offer him. We could all stand to notice a little more. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. There are more coming, and every single one of them starts with something small that turns out to matter more than anyone expected. We'll see you in the next one.